Hello everyone, this is Space Café Podcast, and I am Marcus. As we journey into the vast expanses of our universe, we are discovering more and more exoplanets that could potentially be habitable. As of December 1st, 2022, there are 5,284 confirmed exoplanets. A few hundred of them are potentially habitable, and the number is increasing every year. The idea that the more we learn about the cosmos, the more possibilities we discover is breathtaking. But today we're not talking about a distant planet light years away, but a very real second Earth right here in our own backyard. Of course, we're talking about our own planet, which for some reason doesn't have an official name. Earth is the name only where English is spoken. Terra, you would say, or Gaia, or Dichu in Mandarin. Well, not really, and not officially, but that's not all. Our moon also has no name and is a rare exception among the countless moons in our solar system that are given names. Linguists will know the reasons for this, but at first glance, it's remarkable. Back to second Earth. The planet we call home has the potential to be a second Earth, and my guest today is working to create a digital copy of our planet that will allow us to better understand and manage it. Spire is a global satellite and satellite constellations provider that uses data from Earth's orbit to create a digital version of Earth. This incredible tool can help us track illegal activities such as logging and fishing, monitor plant growth, and more. Imagine being able to see the state of our planet in real time and make informed decisions about its protection. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Joel Spark from Spire at Spire's Glasgow office as we dive into the exciting world of creating a second Earth.
You got a fancy place here.
Well, thank you.
Cool.
Yeah. We're sitting in the fishbowl too. I like it. These pods are great.
You got a bunch of fish bowls, but you see a bunch of people work here. So what's actually going on here, right here in the background?
Yeah. So we're sitting really near our engineering team. And so what they do is they design and work with our manufacturing team, all the satellites that Spire makes, both for our internal data products. So that's kind of the one arm of our business is gathering data from space in new ways, and providing new types of data that haven't previously been possible. And the other thing we do is providing that satellite, our ground station network, and our web infrastructure as a platform on which others can build and innovate, and taking advantage of all the lessons we've learned over the past decade, building our own fleet and helping accelerate that innovation.
Awesome. So let's back up a little. Why are we in Glasgow here? Why is Spire in Glasgow? Because it originates in San Francisco, right?
That's right. So our founding kind of sounds like the premise for a joke. I'm Canadian and Irish. Peter, our CEO and co-founder, is Austrian American, and Jeroen is from Belgium. And we met in France. So tale as old as time.
Neutral territory.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, we were at grad school there at the International Space University. And the idea for Spire was born out of Peter's thesis, which looked at what was the perception of this nanosatellite industry and what could it do, and how did that compare to looking at the fundamentals of the technology and what was it really doing. And we found that Moore's law was arriving to space effectively, that there was this rapid innovation.
Exponential curves.
Exactly. And the thing about exponentials, people are very bad at thinking in exponentials. And so even space industry experts, they hadn't recognized this incredible opportunity. And for us, that was our moment. We said, this is our chance to positively impact the lives of 1 billion people. And so we moved from France. We all, quit our jobs and went to San Francisco. So we're a Silicon Valley startup. We were there for a number of years, built our first 4 satellites there. But then we started to look, okay, how do we grow? And how do we get to the, dozens or hundreds of satellites? At the time, we knew we needed regular access to space. And that meant working with US launches and also non-US launches. Like India, for example, was at the time, they were the number one launching state. And so we knew that we wanted our technology to be built outside the US because easier to go into the US. You can serve the US if you're not there, but not vice versa. So we looked around at a few different places, and Glasgow really jumped out for us. There was kind of that perfect mix of existing talent pool, interestingly, from the kind of cell phone manufacturing, which is actually, there's a lot of parallels to that between what we do and the talent that was here. Really strong universities. The Scottish government is investing heavily in space as well. So there's a really strong culture of innovation, which, I think is kind of underappreciated. And so we recognized that Scotland was starting to kind of punch above its weight in terms of the impact they were having in the industry, and it was a perfect place for us to come. So that was 2015. We moved here. Then we hired an office manager. I was second boots on the ground, and been here ever since.
Wow, awesome. Do you think we can turn down the climate? Because I can hear it a little.
Yeah.
As long as we're not over CO2ing in here.
No, I think it's... I might get a little warm, but that's okay. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So how many satellites do you have in orbit right now?
So in orbit today, what time is it? It changes a lot. Today it's a little over 100. We've launched around 150 in our lifetime, but the lifetime as a company.
Yeah.
But some of those have deorbited now. So we operate in low Earth orbit. So if you imagine yourself holding a basketball, the thickness of your fingers away, that's how close our satellites are, right at the edge of the atmosphere. And that's very intentional because by launching there, we can predict without using propulsion. We know that the satellites are going to re-enter within a set time frame, a relatively short time frame, and not leave space junk. And it also is our niche in terms of there's a tremendous amount of really important applications and data that can be accomplished when you're so close. So very long answer to your question. We've launched about 150 across 30 or so different launch campaigns, and there's around 100 still in space today.
And so they're cube-sized, so they're small satellites.
Yeah,
it's like smartphones up there with a bunch of sensors.
Yeah. I tell people it's like a loaf of bread.
Okay.
And that's pretty accurate. It's about 10 by 10 by 30 centimeters is the size of our standard model. We do some things bigger, big for us. It's like up to the size of a microwave oven. It's kind of as big as we go. So that's technically what's classified in the industry as a nano satellite.
And so the wavelength that you are focusing on, that's also the secret sauce. If you take a look at I was totally blown away. If you take a look at the microwave spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, it's just such a small bandwidth in the visual light that we can see. So there's a whole universe out there that's invisible to us. Yeah. And this is where you are tapping into, 100%. Making that invisible place visible.
Yeah, exactly. We and that was very intentional. When you think about disruption, often it doesn't come from some amazing new technology. It's from combining existing boring things in a new way that becomes interesting. And so for us, that set of things was the CubeSat, so the standard platform for the nanosatellite, which was driving that kind of Moore's law for space. It was software-defined radio, so really focusing on radio frequency and taking advantage of all the amazing technology development that was happening as a result of the the cell phone industry and 5G and all the amazing things that were happening with that. And combining that with really, really cool science that we commercialize, pioneered by the NASAs and the weather forecasters of the world, but commercializing that and doing something that used to be done in a school bus down to a loaf of bread, and adding a little sprinkling of that Silicon Valley, experiment, throw something up, see what works, see what doesn't, learn, iterate, improve. And we deploy code to our satellites in space daily. In the same way that a lot of companies now are very familiar with deploying new code to their cloud. Our cloud is on the ground, but a significant portion of our cloud is also now in space.
So there's permanent updates going on
constantly. It's The sun never sets on the British Empire. The update never stops. We're constantly uploading and relating things.
Let's do because I'm still fascinated by that invisible world that surrounds us out there. So what is out there right now in between us that we do not see? Because the visual spectrum is just this. I did a little research. 0.0035% of the whole spectrum is that exactly what we can see.
Yeah, and I mean humans are designed to see in that spectrum because that's our sun just happens to put out the most amount of RF energy at those frequencies. And so that's what our eyes adapted to use because that was what was most plentiful. But you're right, there's a whole universe of radio energy that's flying around and being bent and distorted. So there's things like human emitted signals, for example, ships. They have this thing called an AIS transponder. It's a radio that sends out here's who I am, here's where I am, here's where I'm going. It was designed for ships to talk to each other. And say, oh, don't go in this channel. I'm going to, because we're going to crash and whatever. But somebody, much smarter than me figured out you can actually receive these signals from space if you're close enough to the planet. And so that's something that we do is we track global ships. We have a global view of all, AIS equipped vessels in real time. 80% of global trade happens through that. And so by observing all that, digital traffic that's flying around in these radio waves, and obviously aircraft are the same, and there's other assets like that, you can get a better understanding of human activity. There's a whole other realm, though, of this is what gets really fascinating. So GPS, for example, there's a whole set of GPS satellites flying out there that are sending down these really pristine time signals that all our phones and our cars and everything use to know where they're at. But those signals, as they pass through our atmosphere or bounce off the surface, are refracted or distorted or twisted in funky ways. And you can actually infer a lot of really interesting things about our planet by studying how they're distorted. So, for example, you put a pencil in a glass of water and you see you see a bend, that's refraction, right? In the same way, those GPS signals, as they pass through our atmosphere and kind of skim along the edge of that basketball, they get bent. And the bending is a function of the pressure and the temperature and the humidity in that air. And so our satellites receive those signals, again, software-defined radio. They receive those signals, and we can actually infer to within 1/10 of a degree, Celsius, what's the pressure and temperature of the air they're passing through. And that's a really pound for pound, for lack of a better term, it's a really impactful measurement actually for weather forecasting because you're only looking at the bending of a speed of light signal. There's no calibration required. There's very low errors in that data, which is really important for weather forecasting. Any little error you have in your data, it's a butterfly effect. It propagates and you get these massive errors in weather forecasting. So that's one of the big things that we do with our fleet of satellites skimming around the planet. We look at how all these GPS signals are bending through the atmosphere. You get a global picture of what's going on with our atmosphere, and you get better weather forecasting, which is, absolutely critical as climate change increases the frequency and the intensity of extreme weather events. We need this data to protect human lives.
So is it a stupid question, but is it legal to use, radio frequency data from ships or reuse them in a completely different manner?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's legal. These are open standards. Okay. So we're not decrypting, we're not code cracking anything. These are systems like GPS or AIS that are intentionally designed to be open. You should be receiving these, right? And we're just finding interesting and new ways to use the data from those to have positive impacts on our planet.
So what is it that you're looking at in maritime, aviation, weather? You mentioned weather already.
Yeah, weather is the most kind of sciencey one. With maritime, what the satellites are doing is actually relatively straightforward. Yeah. They're just receiving these little messages and downlinking that to the ground. But what Spire is doing is we're combining that data with ship messages that we receive with our satellites that are received, in ports from other ships observing that and piping that back. So we get a global view of where ships are, and then we study how ships are moving and where they're going to gain insights. So for example, you can tell if a ship is fishing or if it's sailing or it's if it's, a bulk carrier, by how it's moving. You can even tell what are you fishing for by the types of, because you trawl in different ways for different types of fish. So that's a massive way that our data is currently used, is monitoring fishing, monitoring for illegal fishing, illegal transshipments of fish at sea. We were tracking those Russian mega yachts that they've been trying to hide since Ukraine. It was very straightforward. We set up a tool. We were watching them all the different ports they were trying to hide them in. They've been combining our data with radar data and imaging to study how grain is being taken from Ukraine and actually kind of laundered at sea. So, what the satellite is doing is actually relatively straightforward. You're just receiving this data. But what Spire and its partners and its customers are doing are combining that data and doing analysis on that data to give insights and give predictions that people are using to make decisions and ultimately to make our planet better.
Fascinating. What's one of the coolest observations that you made?
Oh, that's asking for your favorite kid. We love all our data equally. Some of it more equally than others. No. It's where to start. I think one thing that's really close to us is, because our mission is to use data from space to improve life on Earth. And one of the biggest challenges, goes without saying, is climate change. And what I find most inspiring is all the different ways that our data is being used to understand climate change and how it's evolving, to help us adapt and, mitigate the impacts of climate change, and ultimately even to start fighting and ultimately trying to reverse climate change. So starting with the understanding, this data that I mentioned about measuring the atmosphere, you can do very similar things about looking at how signals reflect off the surface, not just bend through the atmosphere. NASA has done an independent study of our data, which shows that over smooth enough surfaces. Sorry, no, that's fine. Come on, go again. Okay. Yeah. So NASA has done studies which show, looking at how GPS signals reflect off smooth enough surfaces using our satellites, you can actually measure the altitude of what they're bouncing off of within 10 centimeters, right? So monitoring sea, in certain locations, not everywhere, but monitoring sea ice and ocean height. We've been doing a project with University of New South Wales. They've been taking data from our satellites, again, looking at how GPS signals, these invisible radio waves, are skimming off ice to map where ice is, and even combining that with a little bit of AI. How old is the ice? Is this seasonal ice? Is this permafrost? And what I find fascinating about that is we didn't even think of that application when we launched the satellites. It was designed with the things already up in space, and somebody said, hey, I have this idea. We deployed some code, and boom, now your weather forecasting system is also an ice monitoring system. So that's kind of a really big one. When it comes to mitigating the impacts of and adapting to climate change, I mentioned weather forecasting. That's a huge one. We also host a lot of third-party applications on our satellites. So, for example, there's one of our space services customers, Aurora Tech. They are a German startup company, and they've designed a camera which looks in optical, but also different, again, invisible infrared frequencies, and does some of that image processing on board, again, combining with AI to spot wildfires. And their mission that we're really excited to be, helping drive is within 30 minutes, anywhere on the planet, a wildfire sparks, you can know where it is, get in there and put it out. And there's obviously human impacts to that, right? There's a tremendous amount of loss of life and loss of property and economic benefit from wildfires. But it's estimated somewhere between 17 and 20% of carbon emissions come from wildfires. There's a massive opportunity to start reducing those emissions themselves.
So there's a permanent wildfire scan going on.
Yes. Wow. Yeah. And that's happening.
Because there's a specific sensor looking for it, or is it just a camera looking for everything, and you're looking in that data pool for the wildfire data?
Yeah, and satellites have been doing this for a while. They've been taking infrared imaging, and what Aurora Tech is doing, which is quite novel, is firstly they're using AI and machine learning techniques to automatically scan through that data and pinpoint things. And what they're also doing is launching more cameras, and so that there are enough of them so that we can scan the Earth frequently enough that we can find those wildfires fast enough, because time is key. You really need to be able to get on top of them before they get out of control, and then you're just in damage mode.
So you see through that infrared data, if there's somewhere a peak in temperature.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is that the way to look
It's
for
that,
it?
and you're combining. I don't know the exact of it. It's their secret sauce. So even if I didn't know, I wouldn't be able to say. But it's combining how fires look different in different spectra. So they're looking at multiple frequencies in infrared, and they're combining that with optical, just normal images, and layering all that together and training an AI model to discern through all that data and pinpoint actual fires and the edge of the fires and where they're most intense.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right.
It's really cool stuff.
So we got the fire covered. Now, how about crime, wildlife crime, fishing? What is going on?
Even that. So, Spire directly is monitoring for illegal fishing. They're crazy numbers. There was a study done recently of 60,000 vessels that we were monitoring, of which 5,000 we detected doing some amount of illegal activity with regards to fishing. That's almost 10%. So this is not a marginal problem. This is a huge problem.
Is that like globally, or are you looking at European coastlines?
That's globally. Because we scan the whole planet, and we work with Global Fishing Watch as one of our major partners. And I think they were the ones that ran that study. We're looking everywhere, and it can be fishing where you're not supposed to. It can be fishing for things you're not supposed to be fishing for. You're licensed for one or not another. It can be fishing for what you're supposed to, but then selling that haul on the high seas and then continuing to fish and coming into port and saying, oh, I only did one haul when you actually did 3 or 4, and selling it on the high seas. So there's a lot of really interesting, unfortunately, ways that this is done. But that's one of the ways that our data is used.
Awesome. It sounds like the omniscient eye in the sky.
Yeah, except it's not. It's an ear in the sky. It's an ear, right? Because there's lots of eyes, but we are the ear in the sky. We're the brain interpreting that ear and translating that into an actual actionable insight. Because one of the interesting things about the space industry is there's a lot of data. Like there's a lot, and we're really only scratching the surface in terms of how much value can we extract from that data, and then what do you do about it? That's kind of the layers we talk about. If there's clean data, there's just seeing what's going on. And then there's smart data. So, okay, not do I know where the ships are, but when are they going to come into port? But then there's really actionable insights like, hey, 4 days from now, because of everything that's happening at the high seas and because of this hurricane disrupting all the ship traffic, you're going to have a spike of traffic in your port. So you need to start scheduling shifts, right? There's some really actionable things that people can do to, benefit their businesses, benefit their communities, and benefit our planet.
It's like, also read, you mentioned optimizing routes, ship routes, for example.
Absolutely, yeah. If you can just shave a few percent even off the emissions from vessels by more efficiently routing where they're going, Spire has a full digital twin of the planet as part of our weather forecasting team. And so, you can take a look at ocean currents and say, maybe the most efficient route to go is not the most direct route. And same for aircraft, with winds aloft. Or maybe, okay, even if this is the most efficient route, you're going to be stuck waiting in line because we know that, the Ever Given is stuck in this canal, Sure. So, one of the things that the COVID pandemic really threw into sharp relief was how fragile our supply chains are. And that's one of the massive ways that this data can help is by having a full picture of what's going on, you can be more intelligent about how you respond to things.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So any insights regarding climate change you feel like that personally interest you, or you feel like that could produce an additional knowledge about climate change?
Well, I think one of the things that actually makes me happy is that it's very mainstream now. People understand and appreciate it.
We're not questioning it anymore.
Yeah. In most places you're not anymore, right? And I think that's been of sharp relief. Over 50% of the key climate variables, that the UN has said we need to understand these things. They influence our models and they help us understand how it's progressing. Over 50% of them can only be gathered from space. And so, we have that mantra, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And so for me personally, there's not been anything in particular about how climate change is evolving. But I think what I've found most interesting and most inspiring is if you give the data, if you give people options and you give people insights, the incredible creativity that people have in terms of using that data to find solutions is just, is fascinating. One of the things that we do, again, with the bouncing of signals, when it's kind of late in the day, if you're on the coast and the sun's setting over the horizon, you see the reflection of the sun on the water. If it's a really still day and there's no wind, it looks like a mirror, and you get that little ball. You can see it. Versus when it starts getting windier and choppier, it kind of spreads out and diffuses. Light is just a radio, type of radio waves. That effect also happens in radio waves. And so we can study how, as signals bounce off the ocean, for example, you can actually get a measurement of what's the surface wind based on, again, looking at the reflection of the GPS satellite in that. But what's even more interesting is you can do that over land. The amount of reflection you get off soil is a function of how wet it is. And GPS signals, they were designed to go through forests and stuff, because people sometimes need to know where they're going in a forest. But what that means is those signals go right through canopy, right through a forest, hit the surface and come right back up. So we now today are measuring global soil moisture through canopy. So you can measure the depth, you can measure the moisture content of soil in the middle of a forest through the trees. And actually, by looking at different frequencies, you can penetrate a little bit into the ground and say, here's surface water, here's water in the root zone. So there's incredible insights that you can gather. And here in Scotland, one of the major carbon sources or sinks are peat bogs. How wet and versus how dry their peat bogs get is a major determinant in how much carbon they emit or capture. So it's a huge knob that in Scotland they have to turn to increase or decrease their emissions. And so by keeping an eye on these peat bogs at a regular cadence and starting to do smart irrigation with them, they have an incredible tool that they can use to fight. And so it's incredible to think it starts with a GPS signal and go all the way up here to Scotland, and irrigating a peat bog is a way to fight climate change.
I just came across a pretty fascinating research project. I met a person who does space archaeology or archaeology from space via satellites. Yeah. So they, especially also in Ireland and Scotland. So when they found hundreds and hundreds of new structures on the ground through observation.
Yeah.
So, this is also an interesting approach towards using data that you may be producing, because you mentioned you can take a peek into the ground. Yeah. So you could either look for water and moisture or look for, solid structures.
Absolutely. That's again, what I find most inspiring is that the incredible creativity that people have given the data and given enough time to what they can discern from that. There's some funny examples. Like I think I read an article about the French government found how many 100,000 unlicensed or untaxed swimming pools in people's backyard. So there's stuff like that.
That's pretty genius.
Yeah. And it's AI. You look for a pool. It's pretty obvious from space. But obviously there's more kind of impactful versions of that. But you put the data in people's hands and it's incredible what they do with it.
So I feel like there's this very strong similarity to smartphones, and how smartphones came into this world. They're just a piece of technology with sensors where multiple technologies came together, like the camcorders and the microphones and the TV sets. So everything came together, and it was up to the users to play with it and find new applications. And this is why then there was the App Store. Yeah. And so maybe this is also something that's happening in your world, that there will be a Spire App Store at some point.
Absolutely. Yeah. And another analogy we make is with, if you look at kind of the turn of the millennium, the web, right? If you wanted to launch a website and you wanted to do something, you're at a charity and you wanted to launch your website. First step was to go and buy a computer, and you put it in a server rack in your closet, and you tried to keep it, keep your sweaters from making it too hot. And if your hard drive failed, you had to go buy another one. So, and, God forbid you're super successful. You have a whole bunch of web traffic to your one little computer, it catches on fire, right? So there were massive barriers that had nothing to do with your charity that you needed to solve in order to get done what you needed to get done. And then came the cloud, right? Where the cloud providers said, we are an expert at maintaining this infrastructure, and we'll make the capital investment to set these things up, and you can deploy your application on it and rent it. And number one is that lowers the barrier to you of doing your thing and changing the world. And it also makes it easier when you're successful to scale and do more of it and amplify. So that's what we're doing through what we call space services. Same idea. So we lower that barrier to entry for people to get their own sensors, even their own just pure software applications into space, by taking our satellites, our ground station network, and all of the stuff that happens in the cloud to keep them online and keep data flowing and, keep them charged up and pointing in the right direction. All of that, we serve as a seamless platform to our customers, and they deploy applications on top of that. So it lowers the barrier to them getting into space. Aurora Tech is a classic example. They focus on deploying their camera and on their insights. They don't need to think about all this stuff in the background. And now they can launch more satellites, and it's easy. It's as easy to operate 10 or 100 as it is to operate one. And so there's a great parallels with the App Store and the phone. There's great parallels with the cloud computing movement for this kind of invisible revolution that's happening in the space industry that most people aren't aware of.
So you mentioned this digital twin of Earth.
That's right. Yeah.
Is that like literal?
Yes. So this is the way that weather forecasting is typically done. You create a digital twin of the planet as best as you can, at a certain resolution. And you then do a process called data assimilation, where you try to pull in all the best weather observations that you have from satellites, which are a massive source, but ground things, from weather balloons, all this stuff. And you try to pull that data in so that your twin of the planet in simulation matches the Earth as best as possible. You got your best, simulation of physics, and then you let it run and you see what happens. And then you do it again and you tweak the inputs a little bit. And you do it again and again and again. And you then take all that output and say, okay, 50% of the time it rained here. And so that's, it forms the basis of the weather forecast. Obviously, it's a little bit more complex than that, but that's the general idea. And Spire does that. So we use weather data gathered from our own satellites as well as third-party sources. And our weather team runs it's called numerical weather prediction. We run a full forecast, and then we combine that with other data to provide insights off of that.
Where do you launch your satellites from?
Anywhere we can. No, I'm being a bit glib. So we have flown with a number of different vehicles. In the US, we've flown with SpaceX. We've done with Japanese, India, and some of the new small satellite rockets that are coming online. So the Electron, Virgin Orbit, the one that's launched from a plane. So kind of anyone, and this is part of the beauty of this nano satellite standard we use, the CubeSat. It's almost a 4-letter word now, but the CubeSat is kind of like a shipping container for space. It's a standard size. If you're compliant with that, well, tons of people host it. And that was one of the key barriers that started coming down. That standardization made it much more easy to make sure that your little vehicle was going to be compatible with any rocket. So that's what we do. We design our satellites so it's compatible with everyone. And we can wait right until the last moment to decide which rocket is the satellite going to go on. And we can keep innovating on the hardware right until the last moment. And that's why here in Glasgow, you see behind you, you've got the engineers. Behind me, we've got the manufacturing site, because it's all the same thing. It's all about how do we, do just-in-time engineering and just-in-time manufacturing so that when that satellite leaves the planet, it's got the latest and greatest technology so that it can provide the latest and greatest insights.
So what's the turnaround rate for your satellites? So how long are they live?
Yeah. So, they go around the world every 90 minutes, which is still blows my mind. We design them for kind of a 3 to 5 year, operational lifetime, which is quite short for a satellite. The conventional, kind of like a supercomputer, super satellites are designed for more like a 10, 20, 25 year lifetime. And they're generally in development for that amount of time. The reason for that is a lot of traditional satellites have a lot of very expensive or very high performance technology on that one satellite. So you got to make sure it's right.
Sure.
Our satellites, don't think of it like a supercomputer. Think of it like the web. It's a network of little individual nodes that each contribute to a whole, whole global view. And so we can design our satellites to be much shorter lifetime.
Sure.
And that's intentional.
And you can replace individual satellites and the whole cloud still stays stable.
Exactly. And from a lot of respects, that's a more resilient model. You don't have all your eggs in one basket. You've got your eggs in 100 different baskets of, there's some complexities with that. I mean,
so it's like a living organism that the cloud ages, but aging is the wrong word, but it evolves.
Yeah.
It evolves.
It does. And what's really interesting is our satellites generally have gotten, as they age, more productive, not less, because the software updates that we push to them constantly are, making them more efficient at managing their onboard power, making them more efficient at, sorting through cluttered data and pulling more out of it. So interestingly, in that 3 to 5 year period, generally the satellites get more valuable as they age, not less.
Mm-hmm. And the satellites that are being produced here, they're from scratch to orbit. So almost to orbit, but everything is produced here in
That's
Glasgow.
right. So here in Glasgow, we have a kind of end-to-end manufacturing facility. We don't cut metal, at least not when we don't have to. So we work with conventional, high precision, but generally like terrestrial providers of, machined metal parts, circuit boards. And then what we do is we apply kind of our own special sauce in terms of resiliency to make them qualified for space. We combine those together into an integrated satellite. And we do it with a shake and bake. So we test them, make sure they're going to survive the rocket trip to space. They're going to survive, going hot and cold. A satellite in space goes around the planet every 90 minutes. It means it's going to go from plus 120 Celsius to minus 40 every 90 minutes. It's an extreme temperature environment. There's a lot of rigors on satellites in space. So what we do is make sure they're going to survive that. Then they go in a little box called a pod or a deployer, which will go on a rocket.
So that's the container.
That's the container. Yeah.
Right.
And it's, in its simplest form, it's a box with a door and a spring.
Okay.
And you put the satellite in, it goes on a rocket. Typically we're hitchhiking. So there's a big satellite going and we're hitchhiking, in the spare mass and the spare, cubbies, because our satellites are so small. And when it gets to space, the door opens, spring pushes the satellite out and you're off to the races.
Do you watch the launches?
I don't watch them quite as much anymore, actually, because we've been successful at our mission at making that part of space boring. So we've done 30, I think it's 33, 34 vehicles now. I used to stay up all night and watch all of them. Now I get more excited about the data. I get more excited about seeing what people are doing with it.
And turning on the satellite, that must be pretty cool. Receiving first data.
The first data
that's pretty cool.
Especially the first images, like when, our customers get that first light.
Yeah.
I've just taken an image of this volcano with my infrared camera, or, we've just run this new model and look at all the amazing insights we're doing with soil moisture. That's what we find more exciting now, because, for better or for worse, the part of actually getting into space, we've made pretty predictable and boring.
Cool. Have you ever try to sneak something personal into it, like a photo of your kids or your partner or whatever, to have something in space?
The whole satellite's personal to us. No, I'm joking. So, one thing that we do is when you join Spire, your name gets on the list, and when your name comes up, you get to name the satellite. So how it's actually named at NORAD and all the public systems, it's named after you. So everybody at some point at Spire gets that personal connection. For our 10th anniversary, we did a bit of a message in the bottle where employees could send pictures and whatever they wanted. And we loaded it up and it's going up on a satellite. So we do officially actually do try and personalize it. But I think that comes through a lot in our culture, that there's the people who come to Spire are here for a mission.
Wow.
And it's a pretty diverse set. You've got people like me who are kind of in space geeks their whole life. You got people who say, I don't care about space, but I'm passionate about this particular type of data. It's a really diverse group of people.
I came across a pretty cool colleague. I don't know if she's still on board, but she does sword fighting.
No, it's great. I love the richness of community that we have here. And we're a global company now. We're 350 people.
Yeah.
We started in the US, but we're in the US, here in Scotland, Luxembourg, Singapore, recently in Australia. So, that kind of naturally happens. Global is one of our values. And for us, that means really getting that richness of experience from all kinds of different walks of life and seeing what people do with it.
So what are the different places, the different Spire places on the planet? What do they specialize in individually in something?
Yeah, kind of 80-20. So they're kind of centers of excellence. There's a lot of mobility between them. So here in Scotland is generally where we do most of the satellite design and manufacturing, although increasingly we're doing a lot of that kind of quote unquote on site where our customers are. Some of our customers want to launch something in space that's a little sensitive. They don't want leaving their country. And so we bring the satellite to them. San Francisco, unsurprisingly, is all about back end. It's all about infrastructure and data. Boulder, Colorado is where we do a lot of our weather science. Also where we do a lot of our satellite operations, and we build and maintain our own ground station network to talk to the satellites. So that's a lot of done out of Boulder. We have an office in Washington, D.C., where we mainly there to service the U.S. government. So we sell data to NASA, which they use for climate science and other types of science. Our data goes into the weather forecasts that NOAA puts out. So we do a lot of work with the U.S. government, and that's where Washington is really focused. Luxembourg, we do a lot of the downstream data science. That's also where our CEO is currently sitting, although probably more accurate to say he sits at 30,000 feet and flying all over the place. Singapore, we do a lot more of the kind of sensors, kind of more deep tech and kind of longer term things. And Australia is our newest office, and we're looking, we think Australia has a really exciting new space industry. And obviously we think we have a lot of value to offer there in terms of being a platform and helping these new companies accelerate. And so that's our interest in Australia.
Pretty cool. So how do you feel about space debris? You already mentioned you are in very low Earth orbit, so it doesn't really apply to Spire, but how do you feel about it?
Yeah, it's a question we get asked a lot when we say we launch a lot of satellites. Yeah. That's a lot of junk. What it's important to understand about space debris, it's how many satellites you put up, how big those satellites are. I mean, how much actual stuff are you launching every time you launch a satellite? How big are they? Because that's a pretty big target to be hit with other things. And how long will they be there? So our satellites are quite small. So they're a small target and they're a small amount of mass. We put them in a very low orbit, so they're self-cleaning. And on the grand scheme of things, we're talking about hundreds of satellites. We're not talking the tens of thousands of that. So, everyone likes to say, that they're clean, but when you look at it objectively, the nanosatellite industry is a really, really small part of what is a legitimate issue.
Nice. Let me just take a look at, coming close to the end already.
Time flies.
Yeah, totally. So what up next for Spire? So what?
Well, I got to be careful now.
Yeah.
We went public last year, right? So we, on just about our 10th anniversary, we went from public to private. So, we got to be careful about forward-looking statements, but, we're continuing on our growth. We're looking at how do we continue to deliver that mission of using data from space to improve life on Earth. We're growing across all our different products in maritime, aviation, weather forecasting, and space services. So I would say it's continuing on mission and on journey to grow and try and make a better place for us to all live in.
Beautiful. So tell me a bit about yourself. So you said you're a space geek. Techie, a Trekkie
Self-diagnosed.
A Trekkie or
that's
Star Wars.
Yeah, that's I was a Trekkie.
Okay.
I was and I like because there's an optimism, I think, to Star Trek. At least the ones that I won't say which one because I'll date myself. But no, I was a Trekkie, and I was a Lego kid. I was the one who was building rovers that explored my roof and things like that. But I come from a family of people who care a lot, and so that it was always kind of that pairing of, technology is exciting. I find it personally interesting, but that's what keeps me up at night. But what gets me up in the morning is the mission.
So we're in the middle of a major revolution when it comes to a new approach towards leaving the planet. So maybe this time we're going for real. So not in an experimental way like back in the Apollo days.
Yeah, I've read really interesting parallels to Apollo and the Vikings in coming to North America and saying that, Vikings were tough people. I mean, why didn't they stay?
Yeah.
Right? Why aren't we, I'm Canadian. Why don't we speak, Scandinavian? And a lot of it has to do with the infrastructure, right? And the supporting network that comes to it. And that's what I find really inspiring about this current wave about space is it's being built out in a more sustainable way.
So we're the settlers right now.
Yeah,
the Vikings anymore.
We're not the Vikings anymore, right? I don't know if there's a good analogy anymore, but I think the point being that you're seeing with the increasing commercialization and normalization, I would say, of access to space, seeing that the NASA mission really focusing on, they drive forward the frontier and then they leave space in their wake for, everybody else to fill in, especially within the new space industry, this increasing democratization and participation in the kind of space adventure, it really in a way that has never been as personal, I think, to actual humans getting really involved. I know I was hiking a few years ago in the Scottish Highlands and I was sitting there and we have a little app, and if the satellite's overhead, you can point, you can see what's going on. And I was sitting there and my satellite that I was named was coming overhead. And it was fascinating to think that thing that's in space, that little loaf of bread, I held in my hands and it's now 500 kilometers above me. It's going at 8 kilometers per second. It's just come over that horizon. In 5 minutes, it's going to be over the horizon behind me. And in an hour and a half, it's going to be back. And it's just such a neat feeling to be so personally connected to something that is leaving the planet. And that's, I think, what's new about this next wave is it's not just governments, it's not just massive corporations, but it's hobbyists.
It's available for you and me.
Yeah, it's really a much bigger movement this time. And I find that really inspiring.
So I was wondering, how does that work to get something into space? I mean, do you call SpaceX? Do you send them an email?
Hey, Elon, I need a ride. It's a little bit like buying air freight, I would say. So there are primes, so there are people who are buying rockets. And then some of them will say, I want to get some money back. And so I will allow hitchhikers on my vehicle. There are integrators. So we work with companies like SpaceX or Spaceflight and others. I apologize to any of them that I forgot to mention, who will buy in bulk this spare capacity, and then they will sell off individual slots. And this is the beauty about the nanosatellite standard is that they can sell it, a slot is a slot, right? And it's sold in units in these little boxes. And so we sometimes work direct with the launch partners, and sometimes we work through these integrators. But yeah, there's a market. You can actually go to SpaceX and say, I need a ride, and they'll give you the schedule and you can fix the price. Yeah, it's surprisingly straightforward. The hardest part is not getting to space anymore. The hardest part is doing useful data at kind of high reliability once you're there. So that's what we say through space services is we don't just get you into space, we get you into business. And that's actually the next challenge that I think a lot of people neglect, is that it's relatively straightforward now to get there, but you have to be useful when you're there.
Sure.
And it's got to work.
Sure. So you got to have a story that makes you special.
Yeah.
And the reason.
And this is the danger of being a geek like me, is sometimes you can get obsessed with how cool the technology is and you forget that this has got to matter to somebody. This has got to have a useful purpose and a real value to someone. And I think that's sometimes where people lose their way, but it's pretty uncommon now. I think people are pretty pragmatic about what are they trying to do.
Great. 2 questions I have for my guests. The first question is, if you picture yourself on a interplanetary space mission, and it's got to be very boring because it's very long rides.
Yeah.
What kind of tune would you want to have on your Spotify?
Spotify.
Spotify.
Yeah.
Here we got something.
Copyright that. Copyright it.
Spotify.
Yeah.
All right.
You heard it here first.
Yeah. Playlist. So, because we do have a Spotify playlist for that, for the boring interplanetary space traveler. Yeah. So what tune would you want to bring? Because I'll introduce it right now to that playlist.
That's a great question. I wish I had a smarter answer. It's nothing to do with
doesn't have to
space, but I've been really into Sam Roberts lately. Kind of this idea of the journey. Whenever I listen to him, I imagine somebody kind of walking across the tundra or walking through the desert and just kind of on their way somewhere else. So I think that's what I would want
Sam
listen
Roberts?
to.
And
Yeah, Sam
a
Roberts.
Specific tune?
Oh, Brother Down, I think is, I like that one.
You can hear him typing already.
Yeah.
So it's in the playlist already. And the last question, this place is called the Space Café Podcast. It's a coffee place. Maybe that's unusual here in Scotland. But still, if you drink coffee,
Yes.
now and then you may want to energize yourself with an espresso.
Yeah.
To refresh, to get refreshed. So why don't you share an espresso for the mind with me, with the audience? You can pick whatever kind of topic you want to pick. What could be a shot of inspiration that you would like to share?
Oh, wow. Pressure's on. I think one of the things that we have here in Scotland in plenty is cathedrals and old buildings. And one thing that always stuck with me was some of these cathedrals, you look at the plaque and you look at when they started and when you looked at when they finished, right? And it's like longer than a human lifespan. So someone had to build the foundation of that cathedral knowing that they were never going to sit in it. Or I think the phrase I heard is, society grows great when people plant trees, the shade of which they will never enjoy, right? And I think to some extent, it's sad that you don't get to sit in the shade of the tree, but it also feels good to know that even if you're not getting to see that glorious future, you get to be a part of the foundation of the thing that created it. And I think that's what we have right now. Again, channeling my inner Trekkie and thinking about the optimistic future, that's, I think, the opportunity we have now when it comes to the space industry is we are building that foundation upon which I hope we become an interplanetary thriving species, thanks to the work that we do today. Even if we don't necessarily get to enjoy it ourselves, that, our descendants will.
Wonderful. Very inspiring. Thank you so much for taking
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. And here comes a fun new coda. I asked ChatGPT, the hyped artificial intelligence that is supposedly rearranging anything and everything out there. And so I asked it to rephrase my invitation to you to rate this podcast. Today I will start with a Star Trek Enterprise version of it. So let's check it out, what this sounds like. Greetings, esteemed listeners to the Space Café Podcast. As valued member of our auditory community, we humbly request your assistance in propelling our show to new heights of fame and glory. By taking a moment to rate and review the Space Café Podcast on Apple Podcast, you can help us reach even more listeners and spread our message to the far reaches of the galaxy. To leave a reply, simply follow these simple steps. Download the Apple Podcasts app onto your trusted Starship's computer or personal device. 2. Search for the Space Café Podcast and scroll down to the ratings and reviews section. 3. Tap on the star icon to show how much you enjoyed the show. 5 stars mean it was excellent. 1 star means it was not to your liking. 4. Click write a review and share your thoughts in words. Your support is greatly appreciated and will help us boldly go where no one has gone before. Thank you and live long and prosper. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.